planning to live in that, came a voice at her back. She didn't turn. I'm planning for it not to be where it is. You could have said you wanted to move house, the voice said, and an old man's boots came into the corner of her sight, cracked leather, spurs rusted more for memory than use. Nash Ordonez, he said. If you were curious. I was. She levered up on the bar and nothing gave. What did this car hold? Before the yard? Nash tipped his hat back and squinted into the interior as if he were squinting into a memory he didn't trust. Mail 1 year, dynamite the next, rocks and bad decisions after that. You know the Verde Spur? In stories. Good place for them. The spur ran to no place people wanted to be except those who didn't want to be found. Smugglers used it when they got tired of mules. Pinkertons hated it because rails don't leave hoofprints. Inez rocked back on her heels and looked up at the old man. His face was a country of canyons. The veins on his hands had the stubborn blue of creek lines. He looked, she thought, like a map you might only half understand until a storm came and all the labels washed clean. You worked the line. Worked the wire, he said. At the junction. Saw cars pass without listings. Saw ledgers change themselves between dawn and dark. Heard things. He shrugged a bird-boned shoulder. Heard tell of an express vault that was never recovered after a hold-up drew attention to the wrong car. What kind of attention? She kept her voice level. The bar bit, moved a fraction. The kind men use to distract other men who are not as smart as they think they are. Nash's smile was almost kind. The kind you see when a fire starts, everyone standing around looking at the flame while the silver walks itself out the back door. Fargo boys ranted about a missing safe for a month. And then, like always, the desert did what it does best. It buried. Folks got tired. New trouble came. He nodded at the floor between her knees. Bolt spacing says a hatch. Nice work. Not the yards. Someone before. I don't want their name, Inez said. I want the way they thought. You sound like someone who spent time listening to the inside of rooms. I sound like myself, she said. And I'm busy. He lifted both palms, a peaceable surrender, and stepped back. But he didn't leave. People had been staying these past months when she worked, men who had nothing better to do than watch a woman choose a task that didn't belong to her and try it anyway, and then decide if maybe tasks belonged to the doer and not to the men who drew boundaries on paper. They stayed for 100 reasons. Sometimes they stayed to help. Nash stayed the way a man stays when he has already placed his bet and wants to see if the horse can read the odds. By noon she had sketched the bolt pattern in her ledger and blooded her knuckles twice. Nash fetched water without being asked. The rim of the cup smelled like old tin. She drank anyway. When she set it down, another man was blocking the sun. He wore a linen suit too clean for anywhere honest, and he smiled with only the top half of his face. Hollis Vance, he said, offering the kind of hand that had never split a thing thicker than paper. I buy things people regret owning. I don't regret it, Inez said. Not yet. He peered into the car with his head slightly tilted, like a hawk considering the map of a rabbit's run. $6, was it? I will give you 60 to take the mistake off your hands. Nash snorted. Inez wrapped her hands in her kerchief one finger at a time and went back to the pry bar. If the mistake has a name, she said, say it. Car's a headache, Hollis said cheerfully. That's all. No title. Spur's dead. Yards mean about trespass. A woman with no crew is a guest where men do not like company. I'm trying to spare you trouble. By creating another. He laughed, delighted. Exactly. 60. No, she said. 600, he said, as if he were offering an apology he was certain she had to accept. Nash stopped snorting. The yard, which had the hearing of a church during a scandal, turned one collective ear toward them. Inez pictured the number 6 and then the number 600 standing side by side like men with the same last name who never spoke. One had the weight of a week's survival. The other was a door. 100 doors. She pressed the pry bar again and felt the bolt turn a quarter in its bed. "Come back," she said. "When I've made the headache honest." Hollis' smile thinned. "Money now for trash now is a kindness." "Then keep it," she said. He adjusted his cuffs like a man getting his balance after a wave. "Very well. I'll save my kindness for the person who owns this after you." He tipped his hat without respect and drifted back to where air stayed cool around men who could afford to pretend it wasn't summer. "He smells like a bank in a snake shed in the same place," Nash observed. "Then I'll keep my boots on," she said. By evening she had 3 bolts out and 12 to go. She owned the ache in her shoulders, the rasp of breath at the top of her lungs where heat made air into cloth. She owned the certainty that she had not bought trash but a thought someone had hidden in plain sight. And she owned, with the kind of sharpness that comes from a hunger you learn to count by, the risk. If she made this car sing, men would hear it. If she failed, men would laugh. She neither feared their hunger nor needed their sound. When the shadows laid themselves out long as tired dogs, she paid the boy at the livery the 2 dimes she owed him and borrowed Garnet, the only horse that tolerated being backed into strange places with patience instead of panic. Garnet was a red mare with 1 white sock and a sense of humor that showed up at the worst times. Inez harnessed her to the narrow wagon she used for scrap, ran the check lines through her hand, and led her out to the yard as the sky bruised purple over the switchback hills. Rule put his cigarette out with his boot. "You're not putting that animal in my boneyard after dark." "I'm putting my wheels to my property," she said. "You can watch, or charge me for the light your cussing provides." Nash laughed and helped set the little wagon parallel with the car's door. Garnet, bless her cranky heart, backed when Inez breathed backward, 2 steps, 3, tail swishing, ears flicking at moths. Inez threaded the rope through a gap in the car's doorway and around the wagon's backboard, made a loop, made another, checked the tie. She had done stupider things with fewer preparations. "Now what?" Nash asked, amused. "Now we make it squeal," she said, but gently. She didn't want Rule to be right for the pleasure of it. She sang to Garnet under her breath without realizing it, the nonsense working song her mother had taught her for the lifting of stubborn things, and the mare stepped backward again, hooves careful, rump firm against the wagon's board. The rope came taut. Wood protested. The wagon skittered a hand's breadth. Inez leaned her weight into the knot and felt the car's door frame receive the pull like a jaw that had forgotten how to open and was relearning, slow and cranky. There was a sound, thin as a sigh. The wagon moved another inch. Garnet planted herself like a saint who had made up her mind about martyrdom. And beneath Inez's heels, the floor inside the car, that floor built like a prayer, felt something and answered it. The planks under tension made a noise like a long-held note breaking. A line appeared at the center seam. Not a line, the ghost of one, the memory of where wood could become not wood. "Hold," Inez whispered. Garnet held. Nash stopped breathing. The rope trembled with the minute movements of time and weight. Inez stepped into the car, put 1 foot on the left of the seam, 1 on the right, and tested. There was resistance, then a deeper resistance, as if a latch farther down, something you couldn't touch with hands, decided what was permitted. She shifted her weight. A click, almost too soft to be a sound. The floor let go. It didn't collapse. It flowered. 2 halves, each neatly captive on heavy iron arms, folded apart like a pair of eyelids opening onto a pupil no one had expected under that face. The wagon jolted backward a hair and then stopped. Cool air breathed out from the hole the way mountain air breathes from a mine. It smelled like oil kept in tin and the memory of wet paper. Nash swore softly, eloquently. "You clever girl." Inez lowered herself to her knees, palms trembling, and looked down. A steel cage was set into the cavity, welded to the underframe. The space wasn't large, 5 feet by 3, perhaps, but it was deliberate, a made thing inside a made thing, with a door that had been disguised to look like the bottom of a plank. On the door, a brass dial the size of a saucer, numbers engraved deep and clean, not corroded, as if something about the breath of the desert had decided to keep this one face from aging. No lock the yard could pick. No hinge rule could shoulder through. Someone had wanted time itself to fail before this did. There were marks on the steel just beyond the door, a scuff where a boot had slipped, a smear of old grease on the edge of the cage like a thumbprint dragged away. Not years old. Weeks, maybe. Months. A fresh nail head lay in the corner. Inez reached for it and realized she was breathing too fast. Don't, Nash warned. Not until daylight. It is daylight, she said, though the sky had gone the color of the inside of a bruise. We just spent it all. Garnet blew softly, impatient. The rope creaked the way ropes complain when asked to turn into bridges. Inez wiped her hands on her skirt, the whole of her body pricking with the awareness that the thing she had imagined, the tongue of luck she had dared to taste, had licked her back. She reached for the dial. Behind her, a dry voice said, "Seems you've found my vault." She pivoted on her knees. Hollis Vance stood in the doorway as if he'd been there the whole time and hadn't made a sound. Two men the size of bad ideas flanked him. Their hair was prison short, their eyes had the polite shine of knives in a drawer. "I told you I buy regrets," Hollis said. "Looks like you're two bolts and one miracle into a very expensive one." Nash had moved, somehow, to position himself between Hollis and Garnet without looking as if he intended to stop anything. "Yard's closed," he said mildly. "Come back when Rule is watching with both eyes." "Rule watches what I tell him to," Hollis said, never taking his gaze from Inez. "Unlike some folks." He clasped his hands. "Now, Miss Calder, we can play law or we can play mercy, and mercy is cheaper. Hand me the dial combination you discovered, and I will give you back your 6, your pride, and one of my better used stoves." "I didn't discover a combination," Inez said. "I discovered bolts." "Save your clever for someone impressionable." Hollis smiled with 8 teeth. "Men who make vaults out of rail cars do not rely on bolts you can see." "Then we're at an advantage," she said. "You see something that isn't there." "I see bolts." The man on Hollis' right took half a step forward. His cheek had a scar like bad handwriting. "We can carry her out," he suggested, almost shy. "Try," Nash said, and the way he said it was not old. Inez put the flat of her hand against the brass. It was cool. It was astonishingly clean. There was a pattern cut into the lathe-turned ring, a whorl, like a fingerprint magnified. For a heartbeat her mind tried to put her own fingertip into that whorl, the thought so exactly correct she knew it was wrong. She pulled back and, instead, slid her fingers along the fixed outer rim until she found 4 pinpricks so fine a person's eye would have missed them if the person was not very used to noticing where men hid the things they feared. The pricks formed a square so slight it felt more like a memory of pressure than an instruction. "Stop," Hollis said, as if he recognized the shape of the motion and not the motion itself. "Step away." "No," she said. "And if you take another step, Garnet will step too, and we'll see whether this vault likes horses as much as it likes greedy men." Garnet, who would step backward off a cliff if Inez asked her kindly, flicked an ear and braced again. The boards creaked. The hinges murmured. Something down below answered with a small metallic sigh, like a drunk waking and remembering his debts. "Careful," Nash breathed. Inez turned the dial 1 notch. She felt, more than heard, a click beneath the floor, not from the vault door, but from somewhere just left of her knee, in the underframe itself. Another notch. Another, fainter. She closed her eyes. Her mother's voice, as always, arrived without the heat that had scalded the rest of their living. "Listen to rooms. Look for hands in places hands should not fit. Fail by inches, if you must. Succeed the same way." A hand caught Inez's shoulder. She twisted without thinking, the way a cat does, and came up with the pry bar in her fist. The man with the scar had grabbed and misjudged. The bar connected with his forearm and made a noise like a struck bell. He swore and stepped back, more surprised than hurt. Hollis' smile vanished. "Very well," he said, silk dried to sand. "Law, then." He dipped 2 fingers into his coat and came out with a folded paper. Cease and desist for trespass on titled property. The car's bill of sale lists it as part of a pending estate under lien. Which makes the thing you are about to open not your business but a court's. Then why were you buying it with stoves? Nash asked. Hollis didn't honor him with a look. Because I am committed to the alleviation of sorrow, he said. Last chance, Miss Calder. Inez took her hand off the dial and put it on the floor, palm flat. The wood was warm, and the heat felt like a living thing, not just sun but breath, not just desert but the heat of old intent. She was aware, in a category of awareness that had gotten her through years where other women had fallen, that if she gave Hollis anything, he would take the rest later. Not just the vault. Her work, her name, her certainty that she had not imagined her own ability to find what needed finding. No, she said again. But she did step back, because she hadn't lied about the horse. If the secret lived where weight triggered it, then a horse would be a better key than a hand. Garnet, she said softly, and breathed backward. The mare sank her hocks and leaned. The rope groaned. The wagon shifted a fraction too far and Inez flung a shoulder into the board to catch it, Nash doing the same. The floor panels hummed, tilted another hair. The dial stuttered under her fingertips, as if a second mechanism inside the first had woken and, groggy with the years, was reaching for a fanaticism it had been built for. Something released. Not the vault door. The car. Inez lost her balance and dropped to a knee. The whole car slid forward 3 inches on dead wheels and stopped, as if a hand had caught it by the throat. Rule shouted from somewhere that wasn't as far as it had been, men scattered. Hollis stumbled back, cursing, and found his smile the way men find their guns when they're embarrassed. There, he said, triumphant at nothing. The spur's not dead. The yard's bribed. A pity for your safety. But it wasn't the rails under the wheels that had spoken. The release had come from inside. Inez felt it with the part of her body that had always been better at reading rooms than men, a weight hidden under a weight, equalizing, a counterbalance finding its home. She put her fingers back on the dial. One more step and you won't need those men, she said to Hollis. You'll need a shovel. He didn't step. She turned the dial. The vault door opened. It didn't swing inward, it sank, a disk of black wood and steel descending on a compact chain like an altar lowering into a church floor. Air climbed out of the hole and put its hands on her cheeks, cool and damp as the inside of an ice house. Inez, who had not been cold since she was 15 and the landlord had sold the roof over her head to a friend, shivered without meaning to. She leaned and looked. Shelves. Steel pigeonholes stenciled a through D. A narrow walkway lost a night. On the nearest shelf, a glass cylinder sealed with wax and bound by brass braces that turned like the bones of a clock. Inside the glass, paper. On the paper, a strip of red ribbon with the tail of a broken seal. The seal ring looked like a bird with its wings flattened to fit in ink. She reached down and touched the brass brace. It was colder than the air. It bit the heat out of her fingertips and gave back nothing. Behind her, one of Hollis' men shifted from foot to foot, the way boys do when their bladders or their courage fail. Mr. Vance. Shut up, Hollis said, without heat. He looked like a man watching a safe he had built open itself after rejecting all his keys and deciding to fall in love with the first hand that had not demanded to be loved. Leave, Inez said, not looking at him. He laughed. My dear, even your horse couldn't pull me from this room right now. Then stop breathing onto what isn't yours. She was shaking, she realized, hands, breath, a tremble at the hinge of her jaw. Not fear. The body's way of letting out pressure without the person's consent. If she took the cylinder she might never get it back again, not from Hollis, not from a court that took him in his clean linen and her at her rope-torn hands. If she didn't, and waited for morning in a plan, a man with a night key could be here and be gone before her second thought arrived. She left her hand on the brace long enough for her skin to stop screaming. Then she pushed 2 fingers under the band of metal and levered it up a hair. It moved like a miser's purse, grudging, precise, promising future violence if handled cheap. The wax joint lifted free. "Don't," Nash hissed. "You don't know what that triggers." "We never do," she said, and eased the cylinder toward her. It came light, but something deeper than gravity argued, a tug that had nothing to do with weight and everything to do with a story not wanting to be told. The tug won. The cylinder stopped 2 inches shy of the rim and stayed there, humming in the strange, not sound way pressure hums when a stopper holds and a hand insists. The hum grew. The hinges under the floor whined. Somewhere in the underframe the counterweight she had woken ticked a notch. "Back," Nash said. "Girl." "I've got it," she lied. Hollis stepped closer despite her threats, the way small men step closer to big fires because they want to say later that they were witnesses and not just recipients of heat. "If you break it," he said softly, as if he were soothing someone else's animal, "it will all be very unprofitable." "I'm not after profit," she said. "Everyone is after profit," he said, like a blessing. The cylinder slipped the last inch into her hands. A sigh went through the steel ribs of the car as if a whole animal had just decided to live. The humming stopped. And the floor began to close. "Garnet," Inez said, voice too calm for the speed with which the lids were coming together. The mare leaned, but the rope slackened, and used. The mechanism wasn't a door held by a horse. It was a clock obeying its own idea of noon. Inez set the cylinder on the floorboards as gently as she would set down a child and threw her shoulder at the nearest lid. It held for a heartbeat. 2. Something under it, teeth, gears, complained, then triumphed. The gap narrowed. The cool air retreated like an insulted host. In that thin sliver of darkness left, she saw it, a second door beyond the first, not steel but old wood, inset with a brass plate stamped with a word that knocked the breath out of her chest. Calder. Not in her mother's hand. Not in any hand she had ever claimed. But in a set of letters that belonged to her with the intimacy of a bruise. "You see it?" Nash said from somewhere over her shoulder, wonder strung to fear. "I see it," she managed. "Help me." Hollis' men didn't help. Hollis didn't move. The lids met with a sound like a decree. The brass dial blinked once, its face catching the last of the evening light, then went dull. For a second all she could hear was the blood calling to itself along the paths under her skin. Then, faint and human, beneath the breath the car had been holding for 50 years, she heard something else from below the floor. Not the machine sigh of gears. Not the disappointed scratch of a mouse's feet. Breathing. But not hers. In the vault, Nash whispered. "Tell me that's the air telling old stories." The hair along Inez's forearms rose like something living. She pulled the cylinder tight to her chest and crouched, ear near the seam, her heartbeat clattering too loud for sense. The breath came again, unmistakable now, 2 counts in, 1 count out, the rhythm of someone taught long ago to conserve air and not panic while they did it. "Who's there?" she said, and hated how small the words sounded in a room this big. The answer was a dry rasp, then water dragged over gravel, a voice that had not been used, or had been used only to count hours where there were none. It climbed the seam like a hand. "Calder," the voice said. Calm as a prayer. Certain as a sentence. Nash swore. Hollis' men looked at each other as if they had learned suddenly how to doubt their employer. Hollis went still in the way snakes go still when they decide they are done being beautiful and would like to become dangerous again. Inez swallowed once and found that it didn't help. "Who are you?" "Open," the voice said. "Now." "Before he..." The car lurched. Men shouted. Garnet squealed, indignant. Somewhere outside, a whistle blew that had no train attached to it. Inez staggered, caught herself on the brass dial, and felt it turn under her hands as if the clock had reversed itself and time were about to do something that would not forgive any of them. The lid jumped a finger's width and stopped as if a fist had grabbed it from below. The breath on the other side turned ragged and furious. Somewhere behind her Hollis said, "Finally," and the sound of a revolver being cocked cut the dark neatly in two. Hands, someone's, closed on Inez's shoulders from behind. She broke the grip on instinct and spun with the cylinder tucked to her ribs. The pry bar clanged against steel. Nash yelled. Hollis' men lunged. The dial beneath her palm clicked into a place it had not been in for a lifetime. Something below hissed like a cat being stepped on. And the floor of the car split again. But this time it wasn't opening, it was swallowing. Inez didn't jump. She fell, head first, wrong, the cylinder a chest stone, the cool air wrapping her as neatly as cloth, as the lids dove past her shoulders and the scene became a mouth and then nothing but edges and black. She heard Nash cussing in a language she didn't know he owned, Hollis shouting a command that men obey when they don't have time to weigh the price of it, and a body, small, fast, drop with her. She hit steel on her side, air gone, the sound in her ears like an ocean you can't escape. The cylinder rolled and bumped her chin. Above, a circle of day shrank to a coin, then to a pin, then to a story she would have called a myth if it hadn't just chased her into the small dark. The vault door closed with a clean, final click that sounded like a judge saying a name that was hers. Someone in the dark breathed out a laugh that wasn't relieved. "Welcome home, Calder," the voice said. "You took your time." "Welcome home, Calder," the voice said in the dark. "You took your time." Inez couldn't find her mouth for a second, breath felt like a thing outside her body that she had to seize and pull back in. The cylinder thudded once against her ribs where she'd clutched it during the fall. Steel hummed. The walls kept the sound and fed it back to her, smaller and sharper, as if the vault were teaching her the shape of fear and expecting her to recognize it by touch. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. The dark wasn't complete. There was a seam of lesser black across from her, the vague suggestion of a walkway, the brief idea of a corner where angles made a pocket for breath to sit down and rest. The air here had been waiting a long time, it had learned not to hurry. Above them, the circle of the floor hatch was gone. The sense of weight up there, men, greed, a horse stamping because she knew when people forgot her, pressed like a bad weather front. "I don't have a light," Inez said. She didn't recognize the sound of her own voice. It came back to her thinner, more stubborn, as if it had lost some of its flesh in the fall and kept its bones. "Left, by your knee," the voice said. "There's a box. Do not open the wrong lid." A scrape to her right, soft as cloth on steel. The small, fast body that had dropped with her moved like someone trying not to be anything but air. Inez slid one palm along the floor until her fingers met a lip. Then another, colder, and a hinge that clicked not with the cheap eagerness of new tin but with the old certainty of brass that had been oiled by someone who understood time. She found the box. She opened the right lid by guessing what a wrong lid would be, tight, tempting, obvious, and choosing the other. Inside, her hand learned the inventory of a prepared person, a stub of candle rolled in waxed paper, a striker, a small tin of matches wrapped in oilcloth and tucked to one side where fire wouldn't find it by accident. She scraped the striker once, twice. The third time, light took the room in its hands, small at first, then braver. They were in a corridor the width of a coffin, running the length of the car but lower, like a basement someone had convinced steel to be. The walls were ribbed with the underframe's bones and the shelves she'd glimpsed, pigeonholes like filing cabinets for a patient god. The candle made the air blink and approve it grudgingly. The flame felt like something the vault would permit so long as they behaved. The person who had spoken leaned into the light. She was not a ghost. She looked like work. 50, perhaps 60, skin tan the color of almond shells, eyes the gray-brown of desert mornings after a rare rain. The lamp on her belt, which she had not lit, said she had no intention of being surprised by anyone's ignorance. Her hair, braided, had gone silver in a way that suggested steel remembering snow. She wore trousers patched at the knees, a shirt that had once been a man's and had been taught better manners, and a vest with more pockets than seemed just. On the vest, a small oval of brass, smooth with years of thumb. It said simply, Calder. "I'm Sal," she said. "Salome Calder, if you require the rest." "Do you?" Inez said. Her mouth remembered itself enough for that. Calder. Inez Calder. "So I heard," Sal said, calm. From the letter that started shouting when you turned the dial, from the springs complaining about your weight being exactly right for a mistake and exactly right for a miracle. Also from your jaw. You have your mother's jaw when you decide you're right. My mother never brought me here, Inez said, and hated that it sounded like a grievance and not a fact. She died before she could, Sal said simply, and in the space between the words Inez felt she could step and never hit bottom. Stand careful. The step you want is 2 inches after the step you think you want. The man who had fallen with them moved again. The candle made him a cutout, narrow shoulders, quick limbs, the kind of alert a dog has when it's waiting for permission to be mean. Don't, Sal said to him without looking. You'll bounce once and then stop bouncing forever. He stilled. The scar on his cheek looked like something a child had drawn with a nail. Hollis man. The one who had suggested carrying her out. He had landed well by luck or practice, his palms were scraped but his eyes were bright with a hunger he had given a good name and fed with bad food. We're closed, Inez told him. Come back when you've learned to knock. He smiled with 4 teeth and no weather. You first, ma'am. Sal's hand, which had been resting lightly at her side, lifted a shade. You can take your chances with me or with the gears, she said to him, conversational, the way people speak to men in saloons just before those men learn a new respect for the physics of their own mouths. Choose one. He looked at the candle, at the cylinder in Inez's arms, at the path behind Sal where darkness arranged itself like a welcome for a person who asked too many questions. He chose wrong. He lunged for the cylinder, not like a thief, more like a man who thought the thing he could grab would certify the thing he wanted to be. Inez didn't have room to dodge. She had a palm and a pry bar and the memory of men's hands where they tried to teach her where her body ended and their patience began. Her palm found his wrist. The pry bar found the place between wrist bones where a person's pride forgets it has nerves. He yelped, high and stupid. Sal's hand finished the sentence his body had started, 2 fingers at the base of his throat, that quick half-circle done by people who have wrestled, who know that breath and balance are married and you can make them quarrel on purpose. The man folded to his knees, then to his hip, then to a prayer he didn't mean. His head tipped back against the steel. His eyes were not bright anymore. They had gone the dull color of pennies that will not be cleaned. We don't have time for sermons, Sal said, not unkind. You'll lie there and contemplate wages. If you try to raise them, you'll fall through that gap by your left shoulder and learn how the vault keeps secrets it has not been asked to keep. He looked at the gap, saw it for the first time, and believed her. A seam you could not see unless you had been taught by floors to stare until your eyes confessed. A drop he could feel as a hunch and hear as a whisper. He did not move. Inez didn't thank Sal, not because she had no debt but because they were not done owing. Why did the floor say our name, she asked, softer than she meant. Because this isn't a bank, Sal said. It's a telling. The vault knows who built it and for whom. It listens for our weight and our ways. Her mouth twitched in a memory she did not hand over. It also listens for men who come here thinking the word for always includes them. Hollis, Inez said, and the name felt like rolling grit in her teeth. Sal nodded once. Hollis Vance likes to pretend he is the knife. Really, he is the sheath for someone worse. He would not have broken the seal today, he cannot, but he can make noise until the man who can arrives. She glanced up, as if she could see through steel in the yard in the desert and the men hunched over their greed. He is on his way. We can't be where he expects to find us. I thought we were stuck. We were, Sal said. Until a Calder with the right weight and the wrong patience came along. The car recognized you when you forced the counterweight. There are doors you open without meaning to. This place knows how to be one thing and act like another. It's been practicing that longer than both of us put together. She turned and moved along the corridor, candle held low, so the floor could see the light and make up its mind about it. Inez followed, cylinder steady against her ribs, pry bar tucked through her belt behind her left hip. The man with the scar edged backward until his boot heel found safe metal and stopped in a hunch of bad decisions. Come, Sal said without looking back. If you lag, the vault thinks you're baggage. It doesn't carry baggage. I have questions, Inez said. You'll keep them. Sal's smile went sideways, quick. That way they don't get bored before the answers show up. The corridor narrowed and broadened by inches as if the car inhaled and exhaled around them. To their right the pigeonholes stretched into the long dark, each stenciled letter faded but intact, each little drawer's lip rubbed by hands that had been careful and quick. Some held shapes, a tin, a folded leather packet, a bundle tied with wax string. Others held nothing visible but the sense of a waiting that could last as long as the word itself. What is this? Inez asked, because the word vault had never sat right in her mouth. It defaulted toward banks and safes and men who measured their lives in piles. Trust, Sal said. The kind with 2 legs. She touched a drawer with the back of her knuckles. When the Verde spur still ran, this car belonged to the Express Church. Church, Inez repeated, tasting the word for lies. Not the kind that tides fear, Sal said. The kind that takes a vow to carry letters that no one else will carry and keep names that no one else will keep safe. Papers went missing in those years. Titles to wells, maps of share lines, lists of workers who couldn't prove they existed because a mine owner preferred they didn't. People needed a place where a ledger could be a person and a person could be a ledger. She tapped the cylinder with 2 fingers. That's not money. That's a witness. The seal. Bird with flattened wings, Sal said. Hummingbird in a storm. My mother chose it because it doesn't stop moving even when the world does. The ribbon's broken because it was open once and resealed by someone with permission. She raised an eyebrow at Inez. Your mother. My mother packed dates and mended everything twice, Inez said. She never told you? Sal finished, not cruel. That's because she was good at the work. The best are the ones who vanish while you're looking at them. She married out of danger. She thought she could stay there. Some men disagreed. They came to a door that wasn't a door until Sal's candle convinced it. 3 rivets in a triangle. A 4th that wasn't. Sal pressed it with her knuckle, then turned it as if it were a thought and not a piece of hardware. The wall sighed. A panel slid. Air moved with it, cooler, tinged with a mineral note like stone that had taken the idea of rain as a suggestion and kept it for later. Do you have water down here? Inez asked, sudden, impossible thirst climbing her throat. Enough to live, Sal said. Not enough to bathe in regret. She passed through the panel and into a space taller than the corridor by the length of a hand. A table had been bolted to the floor. On it, a map of the yard drawn not to scale but to behavior, the parts that moved when no one was watching drawn larger than the parts that sat very still when men's eyes were on them. Lines like veins connected the car to things that were not this car, a culvert, a shallow arroyo, a closed ramp that used to be a loading dock and had learned how to be a door when the right horse backed up to it. Garnet, Inez breathed, before she could help it. Sal's mouth did a small, pleased thing. You made her do that without telling her the plan. She likes you. Horses don't take orders from liars. She pointed at the map. There's a grate here. If Nash Ordonez is the kind of man I remember, he'll have figured out how to pry it before his coffee gets cold. He can get you air. He can get you a word to carry to the one man in this town who thinks the law is a house that can include the poor. Inez pictured Nash's hands, the blue veins like paths on a river map. She let herself admit, for a breath, that she had been glad he had stayed. And Hollis? Hollis is a delay, Sal said. A silk cover for rust. The man he serves is called the auditor. She said the name like someone setting a heavy thing on a table carefully so as not to break the table or her back. He counts things he did not earn and calls that ownership. He will arrive with papers. He will arrive with men who have never been allowed to own their own hours. We will not be here. How? Inez asked. The floor closed. Sal pointed to the cylinder tucked under Inez's arm. That is one part. The other is your weight. The third is a horse who owes you for not letting men teach her that women are unkind. She put the candle in a bracket on the wall and reached under the table, bringing up a coil of lines so fine and strong it made Inez think of spider silk that had chosen steel as a hobby. "We'll reset the counterweight to a password the car likes, then we'll tell it the truth about the direction we're going." "The truth?" "That we're going home," Sal said. Inez stood very still because if she moved the word might roll off the table and break. "Where is that?" Sal looked at her the way people look at maps when they know the destination and are trying to choose the kindest path. "Not south," she said. "Not toward the money. North." The church kept a siding up past the Black Hills. A place where the car could be fed and no one would call it a mouth. Her gaze flicked to Inez's hands on the cylinder. "Your mother taught you to lift with your legs." She expected this day. She just ran out of days. Footfalls thunked above them, muted by steel, unmistakable in their certainty. Men who walk like they own space and have never been told to share it. Hollis' cadence, light and fast, as if he had made a life out of getting out of the way of other men's violence and calling that nimble. Another set, slower. Sal raised her face and her eyebrows at the same time, listening with the kind of attention that made the air feel witnessed. "Not yet," she murmured. "But close." She turned the map around and put Inez's finger on a point that was not a point so much as a confession. "If you go this way alone you will be found. If you stay, you will drown in paper. If you go with me, you will have to decide whether you are the kind of person who stands where she was told or the kind of person who chooses her own weather." Inez thought of $6 ironed under a coffee pot. Thought of men laughing because laughter was cheap. Thought of Garnet's trust, which had not been cheap at all. Thought of the breath under the floor before the floor opened and the voice that had said, "Welcome home." The word felt like a dare. It felt like a door. It felt, most of all, earned. "Which way?" she said. Sal smiled with more relief than triumph. "Good." She moved, and the room began to admit hinges. A panel in the floor. A latch behind a brace. A crank whose teeth had learned to be quiet. Inez did as she was told not because she had decided to obey but because she had decided to decide later and right now they had to live. The first crank moved the counterweight by a finger's width. The second translated their breath into instructions the car would keep. The third woke a line that ran through the underframe and, somewhere above the floor, came out as a request at a particular plank. "Now the horse," Sal said. "You said Nash." "Can get air," Sal said. "And a word. But a horse does not listen to an old man through a grate. She listens to you." She put Inez's palm against the steel, over a rivet that wasn't. "Speak. She'll hear the idea and make it into muscle." Inez closed her eyes. She saw Garnet's white sock. The mare's good-natured ear. The way her hindquarter felt under a palm when she was thinking backward. "Back," Inez whispered, not loud and not soft but in the register that belonged to rope and patience in the 5 seconds just before a lift becomes easy. "Back, girl." The steel under her hand vibrated once. Twice. Then held its breath. A heartbeat later the car's bones acknowledged what a horse had done, one plank in one stubborn inch at a time. The counterweight settled. Somewhere to their left, a brake ratchet gave up a city's worth of notches. "Good," Sal said. She lit her own lamp now, chiming the glass with a thumbnail the way people do who have made sons of things that can bite them. The wick caught. The room learned the shape of them again and decided it could live with the change. "Bring the cylinder. If Hollis is stupid enough to send a boy through the grate, I'll cure him of it." The boy with the scar had edged closer to the dark seam, curiosity outvoting terror by half a vote. He froze when Sal's lamp took him in. To his credit, he set his palms flat and did not pretend he had been brave by accident. "Name," Sal said. He licked his lip. "Greeley," he muttered, like a man giving away a coin he meant to spend on a lie later. "Your mother's?" Sal asked. He blinked. "Lose." Sal's mouth softened, a millimeter. "If you live through the day, go to her. Tell her you didn't die being stupid in a place that would not have remembered you." She pointed with her chin at the safe corner. "Don't move." If you run, the floor finishes what your choices started. He swallowed. Yes, ma'am. Inez wanted to be unmoved. She failed. How old are you? She asked, surprised at herself. 17, he said, proving he was younger by a year. She nodded once. Be older by nightfall. He looked like someone who had thought he had invented that plan and was irritated to learn it had already been patented by Payne. Sal led them back into the throat of the vault. The corridor kinked once as if the car had dodged a memory. Then a ladder showed up where a wall had been. Sal climbed without looking down, because trust sometimes has to happen backward. Inez tucked the cylinder into the crook of her elbow and climbed too, feeling each rungs were like fingerprints. At the top, a grill the size of a bread loaf made a window out of air. Someone had pried the outside grate an inch. Desert came through, thin but free. A voice, well-mannered by years of dispatches, came with it. Miss Calder? Nash said, as if he had been expecting to talk into a pipe to a woman inside a train and had decided to pretend that this was normal. If you are who I hope you are, tap back twice. Inez tapped twice on the grill with the edge of the pry bar. Nash's breath left him in a laugh that did not have time to be loud. All right, he said. I've got Garnet, a lawman who owes me too much to say no, and a boy who can run without letting his feet invent drama. The one I send is headed to Doc Maribel. The lawman says a name is coming that will make people move whether they want to or not. The auditor, Sal said, too close to the grill to be heard by anyone who wasn't listening. Nash's voice went flat. Then we're late. A pause. Who's with you? Another Calder, Sal said. And a problem. I can only help with one at a time, Nash said gently. Start with the Calder. We're not coming up, Sal said. We're going out another way. But you can help. Tie Garnet to the tailboard on the wagon and back her until the board kisses the boneyard ramp. Hold her there. She'll feel it as a job, not a fight. She'll like that, Nash said, amused. I'll tell her who asked. And Nash, Sal said. If Hollis starts making papers sound like God, talk louder than him. My voice hasn't cracked since '86, Nash said. I can make the desert blush. He hesitated. You got air? Enough to be careful with, Sal said, and stepped back from the grill. Time to leave. The leaving was not a door. It was a sentence that required diagramming. Sal knelt and twisted a bolt that wasn't one until the shadow at her feet became less committed. She slid her lamp into a narrow drawer that was, insultingly, a perfect fit. The floor under their boots learned to pivot. The corridor became an incline. They walked down into a darker dark that smelled like pennies and the thumb of a glove that had been wet and dried 1,000 times. I can't see, Inez said, and then could, a thin line of light like a measure of music along the base of the wall. It moved. It was moving because the wall was moving, because they had been inside a thing that had decided to be another thing. The line widened enough to make a choice, and then it was a mouth again, and then a tunnel. At the end of the tunnel, the desert had learned how to be a basement. Stone, not dug but persuaded, a scene where water had convinced rock to let it pass in flash floods and leave a memory deep enough for a person to walk if she walked like a person who'd been told once, long ago, to be small or die. Who built this? Inez asked, ducking under a lip that had the good manners to see her coming and not take off her hat. People who couldn't prove things, Sal said. So they made a place that could prove itself. They came up into a room that was not quite a room and not quite outside, a shallow recess where a loading ramp had been, once, and then a retaining wall, and then a wall, and then a roomer. Nash's advice had been good. Garnet's tailboard was almost kissing the old ramp, the wagon backed until it dared no more. Inez could see the mare through a crack, one white sock planted like an argument, the set of her flank saying proudly that hard work and sense could be married without anyone having to apologize to the neighbors. Ready? Sal asked. No, Inez said, but moved anyway because ready was a story you told your feet to trick them into doing the thing you would regret not doing. Sal took the cylinder from her, tucked it under her vest with the clear practice of someone who knew where her ribs ended and steel began, then pressed the third bolt that had been pretending to be a rivet since before Inez was born. The wall made a sound like a man giving up on a stupid plan. Light stumbled in. Air came with it, kicked by hooves, warmed by a day that would have baked them if they had been fools. Inez stepped into it and swallowed greedily before dignity could object. The yard looked suddenly fragile. Men were only men, hat, boot, habit. Hollis Vance was a color more than a person from here, white, like linen and a smile. He moved the way snakes move when there is music. 3 of Rule's men stood near him carrying rifles as if they knew they would never be as dangerous as the paper Hollis held. The sound of another set of hooves came thin from the far end of the boneyard, the metal ring of shoes on old plank. It was the sound of men who believed that other men would move out of their way before they had to test whether they were right. "The auditor," Sal said, as if they could see him by sound alone. "Will be gone before his shadow learns where we were." "Me first," Inez said, and put her shoulder to the remaining sliver of wall the way one puts a shoulder to a friend. It opened, not because she was strong, though she was, but because the mechanism liked the truth of what she'd said to Garnet. "Back." The mare, hearing the idea like a rope, leaned sweetly until the tailboard made an affectionate sound against old wood. Sal went up and through. Inez followed, grateful for a day when being small was good news. They came out under the wagon tailboard itself, there in the shadow that wagons always drag with them and men never consider because men believe wagons go forward and cannot imagine them backing into a story. "Girl," Nash said, and his relief looked like someone putting down a load he had been willing to carry forever if it made a difference. "I would shake your hand but the desert would laugh at me for introducing myself so late." His eyes slid to Sal's face and did a small, private thing. "Sister," he said, without surprise. "Nash," Sal said, and the 2 syllables had dust on them and coffee in a fight at a telegraph office where somebody had come out with a split lip and a better idea. "You got taller." "The ground got lazier," he said, pleased. Hollis lifted a hand like a conductor. His voice came skimming over the yard, light and reasonable and poisonous as sugar where it doesn't belong. "Friends," he called. "There is some confusion here. A vehicle under lien has been disturbed by persons without title. I'm sure no one wants the county name mired in paperwork. Let me present." He turned slightly to let the spectacle have more air. "Mr. Orrin Cleve, State Auditor, Special Service." The man beside him was not tall so much as placed at the exact height where he could look down on anyone he wanted to. His suit had the wrong shade of blue, the expensive kind. His eyes had learned not to blink at dust. The badge at his belt was plain and ugly, like a truth that would only ever do one job. "We'll be going," Sal said. "Now." Garnet, hearing a decision arrive and deciding it was hers, stepped forward. Nash flicked the line like a question mark. The wagon rolled. The tailboard slid off the ramp and kissed air. Inez caught it and eased it down. They were just another pair of nobodies with a wagon and a mare and the good manners to keep their heads down. Inside the wagon there was a void where a vault might be. Outside the wagon there were men who did not know how to suspect a woman whose hands were clean and who did not apologize for them being dirty. "Stop that wagon," Hollis said pleasantly. "Please." Rule, inconvenienced by the ambiguity of how a woman with her hair in a braid could be a problem, moved to block them on his own authority. Nash looked past him the way you look past a pulling calf and kept walking. Inez didn't look at Rule at all, she looked at Garnet's ear, which told her what she needed to know about the next 5 seconds of living. "Hold," the auditor said to no one interesting, and everyone obeyed him. He stepped forward, shoes not picking up dust because the world had learned where to lay down rugs for this sort of man. He laid a piece of paper on the wagon's tailboard as if it were a plate and he were a tolerable host offering a sandwich. "Lien," he said. "Estate of Emilio Verde. Enforcement order." Sal didn't look at the paper. "Dead estates don't control the living," she said, cool enough to be mistaken for kind. "They traumatize them." "Different thing." The auditor's lip made a small suggestion of a smile and then changed its mind. "Words," he said, "are a poor substitute for signatures. You are trespassing on a sealed asset. Who sealed it? Inez asked before she had time to choose politeness. A man who never saw a river. He looked at her, finally, and she felt it like stepping into shade that was colder than it had any right to be. Your name, he said, though he already knew it. She doesn't have to tell you anything, Nash said, oiled by the courage of being old and right. Men who announce their titles usually forget their humanity at the hotel. Hollis laughed as if he had hired Nash for that line. Now, he said. Let's not turn this into a sermon, Mr. Ordonez. Sal took a breath that was as close to a sigh as she would permit. Gentlemen, she said, and Hollis. We're leaving because we have sick to tend and we are not at liberty to make small talk about law that has not yet learned its letters. You're leaving because I'm allowing you to, the auditor said, bored. Because your wagon is very interesting and I want to know where it goes when no one is watching. Men will follow you who are being paid not to blink. He raised 2 fingers. The men with rifles moved like punctuation ending the sentence he hadn't spoken yet. Nash leaned on the wagon and considered the sky. It's a good morning to disobey men who forgot what mornings are for, he observed. Inez felt the air tilt, the way it does before a fight or a dance. Garnet's flank under her palm was warm and unafraid. She looked at Sal. Sal looked at her and did not say anything as sentimental as now or together. She said, left turn at the mesquite, tight, then straight until the arroyo forgets its shy. I can do that, Inez said. Good, Sal said. Because if you don't, we die. The first rifle lifted. The first shout went up from a mouth that had been waiting to yell since it woke. The auditor did not bother raising his voice. He raised his hand. Go, Sal said. Garnet went. The wagon jumped like a horse that had been bored too long. Nash trotted alongside, light on his feet for a man whose bones had every reason to be heavy. Inez took the left so tight the tailboard scuffed the mesquite and came away with a spray of green on old wood. A bullet said the right thing 2 feet behind them, then reconsidered after it met the idea of plank. A second bullet hit the air in front of the wagon and fell down dead because air had decided it was not in the mood. Hold your fire, the auditor said, and his disappointment made the yard quieter than righteousness ever had. We don't shoot in public unless we own the newspaper. They didn't own the mesquite. They didn't own the arroyo. The wagon rolled and bounced and considered being a sled. Inez kept her hands gentle because panic makes the bit an argument and she needed it to be a comfort. The desert righted itself under the wheels like a faithful lie. The yard receded. Don't look back, Sal said softly. I'm not, Inez lied, and didn't. They reached the mouth of the arroyo, dry now, but with the polite scars of water down its sides where floods had written letters and left them for later. The wagon skated. Garnet found gravel like a truth. Nash, puffing and swearing in a way that would have gotten a lesser man scolded by the sky, dropped back and then cut through a gap in the fence like a rabbit who had convinced the fence to doubt itself. Why didn't he come in the vault? Inez asked before she remembered this wasn't a conversation for Honesty's entire wardrobe. Nash. Because he knows he would be trapped at the part where forgiveness is a floor, Sal said. And because men like Nash have learned to be useful where they are useful instead of where they want to be heroes. They drove. They did not run. Running made dust the wrong shape. The town fell away the way a pane does when you finally decide to walk on it even though it is exactly as bad as you feared. The arroyo bent like a question. Inez answered it without thinking. The wagon hummed. Garnet breathed like a bellows that had chosen him. Now, Sal said. Right. And slow. Right was a slip between 2 rocks that didn't look like a place even lizards would agree on. The wagon squeezed through meanly and came out in a slot where Shade had decided to visit at mid-morning and sit down with its back against cool stone. Sal leaned out, measuring the world with the flicks of her eyes, and nodded once to something Inez couldn't see. The cylinder under her vest knocked once against a rib like a neighbor asking for quiet in the night. Take the next fork, Sal said. The one that looks like it will break an axle. Inez took it, because she had begun to recognize Sal's taste in doors. It didn't break the axle. It broke something easier. A part of the day that had insisted on being ordinary surrendered without apology, and in its place was a mouth of rock that had learned to whisper. The sound changed. Wheels went from thunder to tact. Hoofbeats grew shy. The air got curious. "Here," Sal said, and touched Inez's wrist. "Stop." They stopped. Silence did not arrive. It had been riding in the wagon and only now remembered to introduce itself. Sal slid down and went to her knees, fingers deep in gravel, like a woman digging for a ring she decided she didn't need until she lost it. She pried up a square of stone that had been taught to look like the stones around it. Beneath, a wooden hatch, old and oiled and loved by someone who had taken the trouble to teach would to forgive being asked to be a secret. She lifted it. Cool climbed their ankles. Smell, not of rot but of time well stored. A shape below, the exact size of a rail car's secret. "Home," Sal said again, and this time Inez let the word in and it did not break anything. They backed the wagon carefully until the tailboard hovered over the hatch. Sal slung the line low, a sailor's throw. A pulley, because of course the desert had decided it would need pulleys, took the weight and made it honest. A lever, because of course someone had forgiven levers their betrayals, learned their hands and their names. The hatch widened. "Now," Sal said, her voice gone narrow with attention. "We'll not take the car down today, that would suggest a permanence we do not yet own, but we'll offload the breath we can't afford to carry where eyes can count it." She tapped the cylinder. "This, for one." "Tell me what it is," Inez said, and the police surprised her. Sal's face changed, a weather front crossing. "No," she said, "not unkind. I'll show you when you've earned it or when I've failed to. Secrets aren't gifts. They're debts." A stone clinked behind them. Garnet's ears went hard. Inez didn't turn, she let the horse tell her more. The mare's right ear didn't know where to point. The left knew exactly. Sal had gone very still. The candle of her attention burned without smoke. "Don't," a voice said from the rocks in a tone that had learned boredom as a weapon. "Turn around." They turned. The auditor stood 10 yards away, alone, the way men stand when the men behind them have been told to be quiet so the story can be about the right person. He had a pistol at his side and papers in his other hand and the kind of expression you put on when you think sincerity is a suit you buy and wear on Sundays. "How?" Inez began, and Sal's fingertips laced a warning into her wrist. "You left tracks," the auditor said mildly. "Not with wheels. With men who have had enough of being good at the wrong things. They would have followed me into a cave to be the kind of brave I sell." He looked at the hatch and the wagon and Garnet, who had decided to be carved from copper for as long as it took. "This is theft," he said, as if he were reciting a blessing. "It's rescue," Sal said. "Of what?" he asked. "Paper?" "Of people," she said. "Paper is what men like you make between us and air." He smiled for the first time then, as if she had brought him a sweet he hadn't told anyone he liked. "Your mother said that to me once," he observed. "She had a talent for sentences. Shame she never finished the one about where she put the register." The world narrowed neatly. Sal's blink was the only sign she gave that the shot had landed where he wanted. "You knew her," Inez said, and kept the question out by force. "I know everyone who stands between me and what is mine," the auditor said. "I know how long they last. Your mother lasted longer than I expected." He shifted the papers in his hand, affectionately. "Where is the register?" "Which one?" Sal said. "We built a church, auditor, not a box." "Don't call it that," he said, for the first time letting the annoyance behind the boredom have daylight. "Churches make men feel protected from their own worst selves. I prefer my men comfortable with being monsters." "You're talking about yourself in the third person," Nash said from somewhere to the left where he had become a bush to the unwary eye. "That's always the funniest part before the fall." The auditor didn't turn his head. "Shoot him," he said, to air. No gun spoke. The bush did not die. The air waited to be convinced. "Your men left," Sal said. When you said the word church out loud, they remembered they had mothers. Fine, the auditor said. I prefer to do things myself. He lifted the pistol and pointed it at the cylinder under Sal's vest. Last offer. Inez didn't calculate. Men who sold boredom expected you to measure cost and then fold. She stepped between the pistol and Sal's vest because her legs were quicker than her fear and because $6 ironed under a pot meant you had already decided what things cost. The auditor's eyes did a small, surprised thing that he controlled with practice. Move, he said. No, Inez said. He considered the morals and the ballistics coldly. You'll die over paper. I'll live over it, she said. Or I won't. He cocked the pistol and then, a fraction after that, uncocked it with a neat little flourish meant to demonstrate that his self-restraint was a favor she would be wise to repay later. Take the wagon back to town, he said, bored again. I'll be at the yard with a judge by supper. If the car is not there by then, I will burn the town down to find what you hid. He touched his hat, because manners are a flavor of violence. Miss Calder, he said, to Inez this time. We will meet again soon. He turned and walked away, which was worse than shooting because it declared a plan to be legal and therefore easy. The rocks took him. The arroyo swallowed his steps. The air let itself forget his cologne. Sal exhaled very slowly. He won't burn the town, she said, as if reassuring herself of a fact she could not afford to call a hope. He will buy it. Which is harder to wash off. She looked at Inez. We have until supper to be smarter than we have been so far. I can be very smart for a whole afternoon, Inez said, light because the alternative was to teach her voice to wobble in front of strangers. What do you need? Faith, Sal said. And matches. They worked. They were good at work. Garnet held steady like a word you don't have to look up. Nash became 2 men and then 3 by being in 2 places at once. A length of canvas learned body language. The cylinder found its resting place where rock could be bribed into forgetting. Sal's hands on the line made a song Inez would have learned if the day had been longer. They did not lower the car, they lowered its memory, a crossbeam, a brace, a skin of the vault's breath, enough to make the mechanism above misread itself when it was asked later if anything had changed. If we lie to the car, Inez said, will it forgive us? Sal's smile was brief. We're not lying. We're telling part of the truth and saving the rest for people who have earned sentences with more than 1 clause. Afternoon walked toward them with the kind of stride men get when they think it's their house. Heat changed its mind a few times and sat down. Flies remembered every mistake they'd made and repeated them. The wagon learned to look like a wagon again. The hatch learned to look like stone that had never been hinged. Back to town? Nash asked, offended by his own question. Back to town, Sal said. People think safety is a place far from men who want things. Sometimes it's the place those men expect you to leave. She glanced at Inez. Besides, we owe somebody a fight. Inez nodded. She thought of Doc Maribel tending the lawman, of Grilly learning to be older by nightfall, of Hollis aligning himself with whoever's shadow was longest, of the auditor polishing boredom like a badge. She thought of her mother ironing $6 and never putting them back in the wallet she couldn't afford. All right, she said. Let's go home. They made the wagon ordinary. They made their faces boring. They made the mare a mare and not a miracle. They rolled into town as the light turned that color it turns when the day has agreed to admit regret and the town pretends it doesn't listen. The yard had grown a judge. He had the bloodless look of a man who is on his second life already and intends to own the third. Hollis Vance wore a victory like a waistcoat. The auditor looked unwrinkled by time. Rule had acquired a sense of self-importance which sat on him like a cat that had chosen the wrong lap but decided to sleep anyway. Right on time, Hollis sang. Late, the auditor corrected, because men like him cannot live without the illusion that everything belongs to them including the punctuation. Where's the car? In the yard, Rule said, proud to have noticed. She didn't move it. Sal glanced at Inez. Inez felt a small thread of pride tug at her ribs where fear had tried to take up permanent residence. The car was where it had been because that was the part of the truth they had permitted to be seen. Proceed, the judge said, distracted by the thought of supper. Seize the property. And the persons? The auditor asked politely. If they impede you, the judge said, already bored with the idea of consequences. Hollis inclined his head as if men were dancing neatly under his baton. Rule, if you would be so kind as to cut the lock. Rule swaggered toward the car with a bolt cutter that had decided to become symbolic. He set it on the hasp like a threat. He pressed. The bolt cutter slipped. Rule swore. The hasp didn't acknowledge the attempt, it remained hasp-like, which is to say, stubborn and convinced. Rule pressed harder. The bolt cutter squealed like a pig with ambitions. The hasp refused to admit drama. Inez didn't smile. Sal didn't either. Nash sniffed a little and pretended it was dust. The auditor took the cutters, not because he thought he would be better, but because he would not permit error to be outside his hands. He pressed. The cutters bit and then did a thing cutters do not do, they bent. The sound had a flavor of embarrassment. The men around them performed not noticing with poor grace. Allow me, said a voice like coffee that had decided to be whiskey. Doc Maribel. She wasn't a doctor by diploma, but she had pulled more men back from the afterwards than anyone else Inez had ever met. She wore a linen apron that had once been white and a look that suggested she would not mind if the day presented her with a throat to slap. If you can't cut it, you can bore it. She held up a hand drill as if offering a flower. Hollis took it like a man takes a joke at his own expense when the room was watching. He leaned into the hasp and began to turn, wrist precise, face smooth, eyes saying, see how reasonable I am while I ruin you. The drill bit went in one turn, too. Then it ceased. Hollis straightened with a sharp little breath that reminded Inez that men are most themselves when metal refuses to listen to them. He jiggled the handle. The drill did not jiggle. He tried to reverse. The drill liked forward and would not be courted into liking back. Stop, the auditor said, before Hollis could earn the expression on Doc Maribel's face which said you are about to break my tool and then I will show you what medicine looks like when it is out of patience. He turned to Sal as if they were business partners and this were a minor inconvenience. Open it. No, Sal said. Miss, he began, a warning in the syllable. No, she said again, and laid her palm on the car's side where the steel had learned her heat. This wasn't yours. It still isn't. You'll have it when you change. Change, he repeated, amused. Into what? People, she said. All the men who had gathered to see Lost Theater felt the temperature change. The judge cleared his throat like a man who wishes to enter a room he built. Proceed, he said to the auditor, which is what men say to other men when they mean do something I can blame on you later. The auditor did not move. He did not have to. Two new men whose hats were tired stepped forward with a ram on a chain, the kind you use on doors that have forgotten that they are doors. They said it. They looked at the auditor the way dogs look at masters who have taught them a bad trick and are about to ask them to perform it for company. On my count, he said. 1. The yard breathed in. 2. The car, which had been listening the whole time, decided the moment had arrived to render its verdict on men who believed force was the first tool in the box. Rivets sang. Somewhere inside, something unlatched that had not unlatched for 30 years. The floor above Inez's head shivered as if Gulf water had moved under it, no sound of ocean, but the muscle memory of sway. The car shifted a quarter inch toward the ramp. 3, the auditor said, distracted for the first time in his day by the fact that the theater had written its own scene. The ram slammed into the door. The door didn't move. The ram hit a little harder than the men had been told to hit. The chain took the insult personally. It snapped. The men who had been holding it staggered backward as if an invisible tide had gone briefly the wrong way. The car slid another half-inch toward the ramp entirely on its own. Stop, the auditor said sharply, and the ram froze in midair, hanging from two surprised arms. Back, Sal whispered, Without meaning to, and Garnet, 2 streets away where Nash had tied her under the cottonwoods by the well, lifted her head and put one white sock deliberately behind the other as if resuming a dance she had begun that morning. "Do you feel that?" Doc Maribel murmured, delighted. "The way the ground shifts its idea of itself when a secret remembers its job." "I feel supper getting cold," the judge said, and was ignored to the exact degree he deserved. The car rolled a full inch. The yard boss rule swore, which was the only contribution he had that sounded like intelligence. The chain on the ram slithered like a snake that had got free of a trap by coincidence and would later take credit for planning it. "Enough," the auditor snapped, but it was the wrong verb for a machine that had decided to be fluent. He turned to Inez as if she had done this to him on purpose and said, "If that car moves 1 more inch, I will put you in jail until the sun is a rumor." Inez didn't answer him. She couldn't. Because the car had not moved another inch. The car had stopped moving at all. Something else had moved. From beneath the car, from the seam that had become a mouth and then a throat and then a language, a sound rose. Not machinery. Not metal. A human sound, ragged, then gathered, then stilled. The crowd had been expecting spectacle and found itself listening to a person. "Calder," the voice said, from under the car where there should not have been anyone. The same voice that had welcomed Inez into the dark. Calm as a prayer. Certain as a sentence. Sal's hand found Inez's. It trembled. The auditor's head tilted by a degree the human eye should not have been able to measure, and yet every eye saw it. He looked at the car as if it were a stage and someone had delivered the wrong line in the right place. "Who is that?" the judge asked, indignant at being surprised. "Hush," Doc Maribel said, in the tone used by midwives and women about to lay a man out on his own porch for insulting their intelligence. The scene widened. Not much. Enough. Ere longer than a man's patience lifted a corner of dust and set it down like a lesson. And then a face emerged from the darkness under the car, streaked with grease, eyes fierce, hair cut short as if someone had had to cut it in the dark with a knife and no mirror. The face belonged to a woman. The woman belonged to herself. She lifted her chin and said, "To the yard, to the men, to the judge, to the auditor, I have names." She held up a ledger wrapped in oilcloth the way other people hold up babies. "I wrote them where you could not erase them," she said. "Every water right you bought with lies. Every hour you stole and called it wage. Every man you convinced to forget his own name. Every woman whose signature you forged and whose house you burned. Come take it." The auditor's mouth opened and closed once, like a fish that had swallowed a hook and was considering how to be dignified while dying. He lifted the pistol before he thought about what it meant to lift it in front of a town that had discovered it was an audience. Sal stepped forward. Nash stepped forward. Doc Maribel stepped forward. 10 other people who had never agreed on anything stepped forward. The judge took a step back and discovered that he had not been invited to do that and had to step forward again to hide it. Hollis Vance laughed, high and light as if he had not been paying attention and wanted the sound to suggest that he had. "Goodness," he said. "A miracle." "Shut up, Hollis," 10 women said at once. The auditor cocked his pistol. The ledger woman under the car looked at Inez. Not at Sal. Not at the judge. At Inez, as if handing someone a weight and a choice. "Calder," she said. "It's yours." The yard held its breath. The town learned it had lungs. Inez moved. She reached for the ledger, and in the instant before her fingers closed on the oilcloth, a sound like thunder under sand rolled up from the arroyo. The ground answered. The sky, which had been holding off all day out of courtesy, decided not to be polite anymore. The first hard drop of rain hit the dust and made a dark coin. Another. Another. The arroyo, which had been empty because it was morning, was about to be very full because the mountain had just remembered the storm it had been promised at dawn. Sal's eyes went wide, not with fear. With math. "Flood," she said. "Now." The ledger woman shoved the book into Inez's hands. "Run," she said, not away, but toward, as if run were a direction you could aim at truth. The first sheet of water came around the bend like a horse that had been abused and had come to teach its rider manners. The car rocked once on its dead wheels, alive for the first time in a generation. And the auditor lifted his pistol and aimed where the ledger had been and would be again, in Inez's hands. As the wall of water hit the yard, and the last thing she saw before the world turned to noise was Sal throwing herself toward the car and the ledger woman reaching for Inez and the auditor's finger tightening and Garnet rearing and Nash shouting something that had her name and the word down in it and the whole town finally choosing a direction. The water took the choice and made it urgent. And then everything was river. Everything became river. For an instant the yard seemed to lift, lightened of its certainty. Dust turned to skin and ran. The flimsy stage of men and their paper sagged and tore, the flood walked through it. The first brown sheet hit the wagon's wheels and shouldered them sideways a handspan. Garnet's hooves scrambled, found stone, set. Inez, ledger jammed against her ribs, felt cold seize her shins and climb like hands that meant to pull, not save. The water didn't roar yet. It talked, a low, convincing argument that gathered its own witnesses with every yard it traveled. Down. Nash bellowed somewhere to her right, and she ducked without knowing what he meant until something heavy clanged past where her skull had been, a barrel, freed from someone's porch, rolling with the truculent cheer of a drunk who has found a parade. Sal wasn't beside Inez. She was a streak, vest, braid, lamp, throwing herself toward the car. Not away. Toward. She caught the underframe with both hands as the flood's first shoulder slammed it. The car rocked, not much, but enough to remember its own weight. Through the seam below, the ledger woman reached with one arm, braced with the other, and pushed, teeth bared, a snarl of effort swallowed by water. The jury-rigged counterweight inside the underframe complained, then agreed. The car moved. Not a slide, this time. A choosing. A quarter turn of wheels that had not turned in decades, then another as silt lifted into bearings and pretended to be grease. The flood made its argument. The car accepted and translated. The yard's slight slope toward the dead ramp, designed long ago by a quiet genius who understood that gravity is the only law that doesn't need signatures, received the truth of the water and offered it to the wheels. The ramp. Doc Maribel shouted. Clear the ramp. Men discovered they could be lighter than they had pretended. Hollis Vance leapt aside with a nimbleness that would have been admirable if it weren't so selfish. Rule stood stupid one heartbeat too long, then the ram on its broken chain chose a direction for him and he chose to agree, flailing to safety with curses that sounded impressed against his will. The auditor did not leap. He stepped back once, exactly as far as he meant to, and watched. His hat was still on. His pistol was still in his hand. Water licked his boots as if testing whether his balance would taste like victory. Inez. Sal's voice, raw and threaded with command. Tailboard. Garnet, now. Inez turned. The water was mid-calf and rising. She could feel the pull in her kneecaps, that joint-deep insistence to go where the current wanted. She laid her palm on Garnet's flank. Back, girl, she said, calm as she could make herself in a world that had forgotten calm. The mare stepped, planting. The tailboard lined with the ramp's lip. Nash vaulted the wagon tongue with impossible grace for a man his age and dropped the pin in the hitch so the wagon could become what it needed to be, a hand at the car's back. The ledger woman ducked under again. Something banged, metal on metal, from the car's belly, then ratcheted. The underslung brake released like a confession. Hold her! Nash grunted, and Inez leaned with everything that wasn't holding the ledger to keep Garnet square. The mare shoved. The wagon kissed the car and clasped hands, tailboard to steel lip, with a jolt that made Inez's teeth sing. The car took the ramp. It shouldn't have. Men had said so for years, and then they had stopped saying because the ramp had stopped trying. But would that has been asked to do the same good job too many times and then left alone to rot keeps the memory of being asked. The old timbers, some petrified at the skin, some soft as cake inside, accepted the weight in 100 tiny groans. The flood shoved from the side, the wagon shoved from behind, the car's own awakened math shoved from within. Wheels found grooves that had become almost metaphors. They wanted to believe again. They did. Son of a, someone said reverently as 30 tons of history rolled onto the ramp like a ship taking a tide. The seam under the car, where the ledger woman knelt, closed a hand's width, then opened again with the stubbornness of a thought that refuses to be simplified. She shoved herself out into the flood, caught the wagon's edge like a swimmer, and came up beside Inez, streaming water in a fury that wasn't at the river. She was younger close up than she had looked from the dark, 30, maybe, but with the aged look the desert gives to people who have spent their years in rooms that don't have windows and still insist on believing in light. Name, she said to Inez between breaths, not a demand, a ritual. Inez called her. The woman's mouth did a small thing that might later become a smile. Maria, she said. Maria called her. If you need all of it. Inez's heart tripped, then found its feet. She hadn't known she wanted the woman to be hers until the word arrived and fit in her chest like something that had been designed there by blind hands generations ago. Family, she asked, braced for the pain of maybe. Maria nodded once, curt with urgency. Your mother was my cousin. She brought me to the church. She taught me to hide here when hiding meant other people lived. Then, Inez began, and the river finished her sentence by taking another 6 inches of the yard and reminding them that introductions are for later. On. Sal barked, and they were on, all of them, the wagon shoving, Garnet grunting, Maria and Nash shouldering with their whole bodies, Sal lifting with her voice. The car's iron, remembering what wheels are for, climbed the last stout 12 inches of ramp with an undignified lurch. The auditor moved at last. Not toward them. Past them. He walked with a small, measured authority to the edge of the flood, knelt, and thrust his hand into the water. When he pulled it out, he held something that had swum wrong. He wiped it off on a handkerchief that used to be white and looked at it with the same frown he used for math. A wax seal. Broken. The flattened bird. The church's secret made into an object. A symbol that meant more to him than any human face present. He closed his fist around it and stood, water crawling up his trouser seam, and looked at Inez as if she had introduced him, publicly, to a new and unacceptable idea. You cannot win, he said conversationally, as if time were climbing their shins. You will lose slowly. You will lose politely, which is worse. And then men like me will own even your refusal. Inez didn't answer him. Not because she had no words, she had plenty, but because she was busy winning the only thing that mattered this minute. The wagon rocked. The car climbed the last inch. The wheels found the flat. The world pivoted around that inch. The flood hit the ramp and shot under with a gurgle as the old angle gave it back to gravity. The shock wave lifted the wagon's back end. Inez and Nash held and nearly went with it. Garnet squatted like a saint and saved them. Go, Sal said again, and this time the word carried destination. North. The dead spur was not dead. Not exactly. The railheads were brown and furry with rust, the ties split into so many prayers, but the line was unbroken under the honesty of neglect. The car rolled with slow dignity as the flood huffed at its heels. People, men who had pretended to be furniture and women who had pretended not to be steel, fell in behind without being asked and put hands to steel as if pushing a church. Maybe they were. Maria caught Inez's eye as they moved and pointed with her chin at the ledger and Inez's crook. Hold tight, she said. That book is heavier than bullets. I know, Inez said, and learned that she did. The weight in her arm was a mass. It was consequence. They gained the first yards of the spur before the flood, having introduced itself, chose more interesting company, low places, cellars, the sad rooms men build in basements for secrets they aren't brave enough to keep on top of the ground. The water sloughed off with a hiss like applause and went about its business. The yard lay behind, sopped and spitting nails. No one cheered. Breaths were too busy. Feet were too busy. The car squealed like an old hinge that has accepted the idea of moving and is negotiating terms. Stop them, the auditor called, not yelling, he didn't need to, his voice had been trained in rooms that made other people perform hush for him. Seize the wagon. Bring me the book. Two of Rule's men thought about trying. Doc Maribel raised her hand drill like a wand and took one step, and men who had wrestled steers backed away from a woman with a tool because of what her eyes promised. Hollis Vance, to his small credit, did not try. He looked down at his ruined handkerchief, then up at the moving car, and his smile became the blank place on a map labeled "Here be something." It was the first time Inez had seen him empty of rehearsed expression. It made him almost human. After them, the judge said, because he had a line and he meant to deliver it. No one moved. The auditor did not chase. He watched. He stowed his pistol. He tucked the seal in his pocket as if putting away a bet he intended to cash at a quieter table. Then he turned and walked toward the main street, and the street, this was the worst of it, made room. They were out of yard. They were on the fringe of town now, where boards go gray and fences give up and the desert begins to consider repossession. The spur angled behind the last row of adobe houses like a thought men had meant to finish but did not. Beyond, the ground folded into gullies. Beyond that, the black hills waited with their reasonable shadows. Rest, Sal said, when the first rise took their breath and they pretended not to notice. Not you, horse. You're perfect. Garnet flicked an ear as if she had known that all along. Inez swallowed the shaking in her hands and found it would not be swallowed. She let it live. Maria leaned beside her, shoulder to shoulder, warm and real. I thought you were dead, Inez said, before caution could draft a better line. Maria's laugh was a scrape of sand on tin. I was many things that are cousins to it. She pinched water from the corner of her eye with strong fingers. Your mother brought me bread the night I went down. She said if the world never saw me again, she wanted me to know it wasn't because I had no witnesses. She never told me, Inez said, too quickly, then regretted it. She didn't tell you because she was fair, Maria said. She did not want you to inherit our enemies. But enemies have a way of claiming us without our consent. She tipped her chin at the book. Which is why you inherit our work instead. The work was straightforward in the short, and impossible in the long. Short, get the car to the Black Hills siding Sal had promised. Long, place the ledger where it could not be made into a courtroom toy. They started with the short. Sal went to the front corner, shoulder against the car, face bright with that strange joy certain people find when the world becomes exactly as hard as advertised. Nash, lungs whistling, set his back the way men do when they decide pain is cheaper than letting someone younger worry. Doc Maribel took the rear, barking small, useful blasphemies at anyone who pushed without lifting. Houses slid past. People emerged, not a crowd at first, just doorways sprouting faces. A child cheered and then covered his mouth, either in shame at his disobedience or in shock at the sound he'd made in a town where silence had always been safer than song. An old woman, Alba, who used to sell pinyon cookies before prices learned to be cruelties, spat neatly in the dust in the auditor's general direction and fell in with them, hands sure on steel. The street behind them made new sounds. Not boots. Hooves. Not a mob. A formation. Men whose horses knew exactly how much weight a bridle meant. Deputies, Nash puffed. Borrowed or bought. They can't stop a car with sidearms, Doc Maribel said crisply. Not if we make this turn. The turn wanted to be a mistake. The spur pinched between a wash and the back of a warehouse whose builder had decided to pretend rails would never have opinions again. The car's rear axle kissed the warehouse corner hard enough to leave a love bite. The front wheel climbed a stone that should have been moved in '99. The whole machine paused, thought about picking a fight with physics, and then remembered physics is only the name men give to patience. Now, Sal breathed, and Garnet gave them one sweet step at the exact sweet angle and the wheel slid off the stone like a bead off the wrong thread and down onto the right one. The car cleared. The deputies' horses didn't. On the far side of the warehouse, the wash had overrun its polite boundaries and made its own path 2 feet deeper than horse sense could like. The first mount hit the drop and thought better of it too late. The second saw that editor's note and tried to write a better sentence and failed. A tangle of reins and good animals reminded the men atop them that legs are not law. Keep moving, Sal said, And no one argued. The ground changed under their boots. The town wore out. Creosote gathered in the seams. Lizards watched without allegiance from the tops of rocks. The rails ran like a lie that had somehow become honest in its persistence. The first pitch of the hill presented itself, not cruel yet, that would come, but clear. We should be followed, Nash observed, as if insulted on principle that drama had not kept pace. Where is he? He doesn't chase, Sal said. He arrives. As if summoned by grammar, the auditor became a rumor ahead, at the mouth of the cut, where the spur entered the first of the low black canyons. He was not on foot now. He had a horse of the sort men buy when they want to be photographed. He sat easy. He had shed the judge and rule on Hollis and acquired 2 men without badges who wore their hats like alibis. They had a chain stretched waist-high across the rails, locked to iron stakes someone had driven when none of them were breathing hard. Sal stopped first. The pushers behind learned the news by bumping into her and knew it was time to listen. Don't, Maria murmured in Inez's ear, when the first flavor of rage rose. Anger is the auditor's liquor. He drinks other people's and calls that discipline. The auditor's horse sidled and came quiet again. He inclined his head to them as if they were arriving at his porch. Turn back, he said in a voice meant for good rooms and juries. You can't win in a place where I am the floor. We have names, Maria said. And we have a town that wants to hear them. He smiled. Say them. Say 100, say 2, say 500. We will litigate until your grandchildren fall asleep in courthouses and wake up old. Where does your breath live in that story? He nodded at the chain, the canyon walls. Turn back. Sal stepped forward until she was too near to be polite. The chain twanged once in the wind. Her voice was very soft. You will move that, Orrin. First name. The old intimacy of true enemies. He turned his head a fraction, curious. Will I? Because if you don't, she said, you will have to choose which is worse, your reputation for inevitability cracking, or killing an entire town on a bright afternoon where the black rock will echo their names until the week dies. She lifted her chin at the canyon behind him, where even the lizards were listening. This place has never liked you. It will remember. He considered memory as if he were looking at an asset ledger that could be moved from one column to another cheaply. I don't need to kill them all, he said mildly. Just 1. Perhaps 2. His eyes moved, past Sal, past Maria, found Inez, knew her as the fulcrum, paused. You, he said, conversational, to her. Bring me the ledger and I will let the rest go on pretending they are free in the ways that matter to them. You mean the ways that don't matter to you, Inez said. Her voice didn't sound like a stranger's anymore. It sounded thin and fierce and exactly large enough to hold what she was about to put in it. No. He sighed as if disappointed by weather. Very well. Then this is where your mother's stubbornness ends. People often mistake obstinacy for courage in families. You knew her, Inez said again, and this time it was not a question. His gaze flicked to Sal. Everyone knew her. Some of us were paid to pretend otherwise. He nodded at the chain. The men with the hats like alibis didn't move. He reined his horse one step closer so that the sunlight glanced from his boot polish to the locked padlock in the chain. Turn back, he said again, silky as a bad promise. Or, Doc Maribel said, stepping to the front where no one had elected her but everyone recognized her jurisdiction, you can witness your last good chance to be a human. She held up her hand drill, then tossed it lightly and caught it, not to threaten, but to remind the world that hands make things and unmake them every day without court. Someone, laughed, not mockery. A release. Alba, the cookie seller. Then another. Then it wasn't laughter, it was a sound towns make when they've chosen a side. Not a cheer. Not yet. The breath before one. Sal looked at Inez and tipped her head very slightly toward the chain, which was, after all, only links and metaphor. I can't cut it, Inez said quietly. Not before someone bleeds for the time it takes. No, Sal said. Don't cut it. Answer it. What? Speak horse to iron. Inez blinked once and then understood, in her ribs, not her head. She tucked the ledger deeper under her arm and put her palm on Garnet's neck. Back, she whispered. The mare shifted her weight. The wagon groaned. The car rolled one soft inch backward. The chain eased a hair, not much, not a surrender, an intake of breath. Now, Sal said. Forward. Inez didn't move. She thought it. She placed the knowledge of pressure and angle into her shoulder and her palm and into a word she did not say but felt, and the mare, saint that she was, took one decisive step up. The car rolled. The chain took the shock. Metal sang an ugly bar of music and then a more interesting one. The padlock flicked like a tongue. The stake on the left wobbled in its bed where a man who had never put fence posts in his life had put it today for the first time. Again, Sal said. The world narrowed to hoof, hinge, wheel, link. People fell silent to make room for the lesson. Inez leaned into the word without her mouth. Garnet answered without her ears. The car rolled, kissed the chain, stopped. The chain lifted a quarter inch. The stake on the left woke to the memory of being wood pretending to be iron and decided to remember wood. It bent. The auditor said nothing. His eyes were very open now. He sat very still as if a sudden predator had arrived and he had not yet been allowed to choose which direction to run. Again, Sal said. The chain lifted a half inch. The stake on the left gave and then lied about having given and then gave again. The padlock's hasp distorted with a little sound of protest, astonished to find itself in pain. Again, Sal said. The stake came out. The chain swung, to the right this time, because the man on that side had more pride than sense, and snapped taut around his thigh. He yelped, went down. The horse under the auditor danced one small, involuntary step. He brought it still with a knee and a thought. The padlock banged the rail and became a lesson about cheap iron. Sal did not smile. Doc Maribel did, broad and blessed. Maria's shoulder found Inez's. Nash, who had been pretending to be winded to hide the embarrassments of age, straightened and grinned like a boy. Move it aside, Sal said simply, and 20 hands obeyed. The chain slithered. The way cleared. The canyon breathed the way canyons do when they are the throat of a song you haven't learned yet. The auditor did not draw. He did not need to. He looked at Inez again, and in his eyes she saw what she needed. He was learning. About them. About the limits of the tools he had selected a lifetime ago because they didn't require him to grow. You have bought a moment, he said. Spending it will cost more than you own. We don't own anything, Inez said, and felt how clean that was in her mouth. We belong to one another. They moved. The canyon took them in. Black basalt shouldered the sun. Heat left their heads alone. The air smelled like iron and a story told under blankets by a voice you trust. The rails curved like a secret. Far down the cut, the siding waited, a length of track straight enough to accept a car and quiet enough to let it rest. Almost, Sal said. Steady. They weren't steady. They were a scraped wire blue with sparks. But they believed her. The car hissed as the flood fell out of its belly in tired trickles. Garnet's sides slicked with honest sweat. Inez's forearms ached like truths. The ledger hunted her pulse and found it and settled. What will you do with it? Maria asked, not taking her eyes off where Will would meet rail. Read it, Inez said. Out loud. She surprised herself. In the square. Today. Before supper. Sal's glance was sharp and fond. Good. Then what? Nash asked. You think he'll let ink undo a man paid to pretend ink is his friend? No, Inez said. But people will. They reached the siding. It was both less and more than promise. The rails were whole. The ties were okay where they needed to be and rotten where failure would be funny instead of fatal. A low shed slumped beside it like a tired uncle. Sal clapped the shed with her palm and it woke enough to remember a door. Inside, oil, old and gummy but not gone, a pump handle, a dozen tools wrapped in cloth that had been eaten by time and saved by intention. Home, Sal said, and this time the word did not make Inez shy. It made her taller. They set the handbrakes with a seriousness some men reserve for baptism. The car sighed into place. Garnet dropped her head and blew hard and loud and proud. Doc Maribel kissed the mare between her eyes because some things require ceremony. Nash sat down and pretended he'd meant to sit to count gravel anyway. Alba produced 2 cookies from somewhere the flood had not asked for an accounting and pressed one into Inez's palm with a look that said, "Eat this, you cannot save people on an empty stomach, even if you insist on trying." "Now?" Maria asked. "Now," Inez said. She looked down at herself, soaked skirt, skin knuckles, a cut she had not noticed leaking down her calf, and laughed because none of it mattered. She tucked the ledger under her arm and turned back toward town. "Come." "Not all," Sal said. "I stay with the car." "It's safe," Inez said. "It is safer," Sal corrected. "But the auditor has learned to hurt ideas by damaging their rooms." "Not today." She touched Inez's shoulder, hundreds of words in the brief weight of it. "Go. Stand where people can hear. Keep your voice when men interrupt. When your legs want to run, remember where they led you today." Maria took the other side of Inez's shoulder as if they were carrying something that could not be dropped. Nash rolled his neck and made a sound like a door deciding against being haunted. Doc Maribel, suddenly, was holding bandages. She wrapped Inez's calf in 3 neat circles and tied the knot with a tug that said, "You will not be noble and bleed in front of boys, you will be practical and speak standing up." They walked back. Down the cut, past the now fallen chain like a dead snake, past the warehouse with its new bite mark, past the mesquite that had given up a spray of green to bless a wagon's corner. The town was still wet and stupid with surprise. People had come out of their houses because flood chose their porches over their stoves. Faces, curious, cautious, angry, tired, turned as Inez passed. The square was a square only in the sense that it was the place where paths crossed while men had their coffee and women did the arithmetic of meals. There were 3 benches and an oak that had learned to be alive in a place that kept trying to teach it otherwise. Inez climbed the first bench, found it too small, climbed the next, then laughed and climbed the third because she had never been tall and this was as high as she needed. Maria stood beside her. Nash in front, not as a shield but as a focus. Doc Maribel to one side, arms folded, an expression that dared anyone who loved their teeth to interrupt as a hobby. Alba handed the second cookie to Greeley, the boy with the scar, who looked startled to be temporarily assigned to the good guys and ate like someone who had just noticed hunger was a solvable problem. Inez opened the ledger. The paper inside smelled like wax and old rooms where important words had been stored next to bread. The first page was a list of names, each written in a hand that wanted to be legible even when frightened. Next to each name, a notation, a claim number, a date, an exchange. At the bottom of the page, in a hand Inez would have known in the dark, even in a language she did not speak, her mother's, a small note, "Hummingbird says fly." Her heart did a thing that wasn't a break and wasn't a heel. It was a joining. She looked up. The town was in ear. At the far edge of the square, the auditor had placed himself like a bookend. Hollis beside him, smile back on like a cheap shirt. The judge sweating. Rule pretending he had lost his voice from flood and not cowardice. The deputies who had failed at the wash now on foot, embarrassed and very willing, in Inez's opinion, to be redeemed. She read. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Names carry. A woman's first name, then the second name men try to replace with their own, then the name of the land men had tried to steal, an arroyo, an orchard, a windmill whose sound had been part of a child's dreams. She read theft. She read signatures that did not belong to the hands that supposedly wrote them. She read hours miscounted, wages salted, a death paid to in coffee and applauded as a benefit. She read the names of men who had signed in their own hands to lie and the names of the clerks who had sharpened the lies into tools and been paid with a different envelope under the table. She read, and every third or fourth name she lifted her head and let the town answer. A soft sound at first, like a wind learning to be quieter. Then it thickened. Someone sobbed once, not the kind that begs, the kind that claims. Someone laughed, a sharp, angry laugh that meant a person had just recognized the size of the insult and it had made them strong, not small. The auditor listened. He did not interfere because this was not where he would lose. He would lose in rooms where men wore neckties and the air smelled like sealing wax. He would be patient. Hollis shifted, ever so slightly, and found a place behind the auditor where his shadow lined up with authority. He would live longer than he deserved because he was quick at that. Rule slid around the back of the crowd to a spot near the well where he could claim later that he had been drawing water for the thirsty while women made trouble. Inez turned a page. Another list. Then another. Halfway through the third, she found a name that made the bench drop under her feet, Calder, Luz, her mother, next to a notation that did not list a well or a claim but a delivery, 2 measures of names placed in vault. Payment, none. Witnesses, Maria Calder, Salome Calder, N. Ordonez. She looked up and found Nash in the crowd. He tipped his hat once without apology. The square shifted its weight. The sound changed. It went from listening to choosing. A man, Joaquin, who owned the feed store, who had always kept a balance between fair price and survival, stepped forward. "That's my sister," he said, touching a name Inez had just spoken. "You wrote her down where they couldn't erase her?" "Your sister wrote herself down," Inez said. "We kept the paper alive." Doc Maribel stepped into the space beside him without displacing him. "Whose name is next to the theft?" she asked sweetly, and Inez read it, and a head turned, in the crowd, and a man whose backbone had been learned from money and not love straightened and learned, briefly, how fragile he was. "Enough," the auditor said at last, when the sound got to a temperature he didn't like. "This is not court. This is slander." "It's testimony," Doc Maribel said. "Slander is what you do to girls who say men hurt them in rooms with no windows. This is the window." He lifted his hand. Deputies who had been waiting to be told what sort of men they were moved from foot to foot, then stayed. He had miscounted their hunger for redemption. "Arrest her," the judge squeaked, and not a soul moved because he had lost his habit of calling himself human before he asked others to be. The auditor took one measured step into the square. "You think a book will save you," he said to Inez. "You think attention is salvation. It is not. Tomorrow you will be hungry again. Next week your horse will throw a shoe. Next month a man will come to your door and ask whether you are as brave then as you are now, and he will not wear a badge and you will not want your neighbors to hear you answer him." "I will be brave then," Inez said, surprising herself with the simple truth in it. "Because I was today." She held the ledger higher. "And I will not be alone." Maria touched the ledger and spoke not to the auditor, but to the town. "There are copies," she said. "The lie was true enough for today. Burn one and the smoke will spell the others. Shoot one of us and 100 more mouths will wake up hungry for your secrets." "Careful," Hollis murmured to the auditor, "too low for most, not low enough. They're playing a different game. Don't give them a martyr." "Ah," the auditor said softly, something like pleasure in the syllable. "So you think you are safe because I prefer theater to blood." He considered this, then shrugged very slightly, a man adjusting his collar. "I prefer success to theater." He took a step closer. The crowd reshaped, not to leave room for him, but to leave him nowhere to put a foot that wasn't a claim he would regret. He recognized that and stopped. His gaze met Inez's. He did not blink. "Say your names," he said. "I will say mine later," wearing shrugs at tears. He turned and walked away. No one cheered then either. Fear is not a thing you drown once and call done. It returns, tries new doors. But something else had arrived, and it was not leaving, the knowledge of each other shared in daylight. Inez read until her throat burned and her breath learned to be larger. She read until people began to move in the square, not away from danger but toward work, toward the church basement where papers could be dried, toward the doc's office where men who had been fools could confess, toward the feed store where a new ledger would be opened and the old lies kept next to it in a box labeled "Do Not Touch Unless You Forgot How to Be a Person." Evening bled along the rooftops. The mountain storm had run ahead and grown tired on the flats. The arroyo had spit out what it couldn't keep. The town smelled like wet iron and second chances. When she closed the ledger at last, Inez's hands would not stop shaking, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was momentum with nowhere to go. Maria took the book and tied it in oilcloth again while Doc Maribel pressed a cup of water into Inez's hand and watched her drink the whole of it like an exam proctor. Nash ambled up, his face creased with more emotions than he was prepared to admit. "You did it," he said, as if it were a small thing and exactly the thing he had expected. "We moved the car," Inez said, hoarse. "You moved the floor," he corrected. "He'll be back." "I know," she said. "Then what?" She turned her head in the direction of the canyon where the car rested and felt, very distinctly, the shape of the day's work in her bones. "We keep it fed," she said. "We keep it honest. We teach people to use it. We make more names. We take names off papers where they don't belong. We get good at boring men until they tell the truth to make us stop." Doc Maribel grinned at that. "That's medicine," she said. "I know it when I hear it." A brass band worth of clatter announced Hollis Vance before he spoke. He had shed some wet and some pride and combed his hair because men believe grooming is a blessing they can bestow on themselves and call it penance. He stopped 6 feet away and held up both hands so that any woman within range could decide whether breaking his fingers would be necessary. "I came to congratulate you," he said, and somehow managed to sound almost sincere. "And to negotiate." "No," Maria said, already bored. "You haven't heard my offer," he protested lightly. "We don't need it to know its shape," Doc Maribel said. "It will be flattering, clever, and have a knife in the last paragraph." Hollis winced. "I am not a simple man." "That's the problem," Alba said crisply, strolling up with a basket. "Simple would be fine." She plucked a cookie free and pressed it into his hand with the authority of a grandmother who had decided to improve your blood sugar whether you agreed or not. "Eat while you practice thinking." Hollis looked at the cookie as if uncertain whether it was food or jurisprudence. He ate it. "I can be useful," he said, chewing humility for once. "I know where his letters sleep. I know how he pays who he pays. I know the names he calls his other names when he wants them to do things he can't sign." Inez studied him. He didn't meet her eyes. "Why?" she asked, and let the word hum with all the reasons a man like him could turn. He licked a crumb from his thumb and had the grace to be ashamed of how human the gesture was. "Because he will not forgive me for today," he said bluntly. "Because you will not forget me for tomorrow. Because I prefer being invited to the second kind of future." Maria's expression went through 3 weather systems before settling on weary acceptance. "You'll fetch," she said. "And when you lie, it will be to the man who deserves it." Hollis blinked, then smiled, the first honest one Inez had seen on his face. "Yes," he said simply. "I will fetch." "Start now," Doc Maribel said. "Bring me a list of the names he uses when he doesn't want his shoes dirty. And if you're wise, bring it to Nash first, so he can decide whether you live long enough to give it to me." Hollis bowed, absurd an apartment at once. He hesitated, then to Inez, "You read well." "I had a good book," she said. He left, lighter by 1 cookie and perhaps a conscience. The square thinned as people went to salvage and supper and to tell stories louder than fear. Maria stood very close to Inez, as if listening for a thing inside her that only family could hear. "What?" Inez asked. "Your knees," Maria said, amused, and Inez realized she was trembling again. "Adrenaline," Doc Maribel diagnosed. "And hunger. And the fact that you pushed 30 tons uphill on a biscuit and a miracle." She shoved a heel of bread into Inez's hand that had absolutely not existed a second ago. "Eat. Then go to Sal." "Sal," Inez repeated, suddenly worried. "We left her alone." "She's never alone," Nash said. But go. They went. Maria walked with her past the places where Flood had written its autographs. The sky had that scoured look it gets after weather tells the truth. The cut was a bottle of cool air poured slow on the back of the neck. The siding shed looked less tired. The car, good steel, stubborn wood, rested like a chest rising after a long, honest labor. Sal was on the step, boots off, wringing her braid out like a rope. She lifted a hand in greeting that did not need better words. "You were loud," she said. "Good. We need 1,000 copies," Inez said, breathless with the size of the future. 2,000. We need to teach people to copy when we are sleeping. We need to. We will, Sal said. Tomorrow. She reached into the car and brought out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth of the old kind, the kind that still smelled faintly of flax and women. For tonight. What is it? Inez asked, fingers revving already. Proof, Sal said softly. Of a different sort. She unwrapped the bundle. Inside, a little journal, not the ledger, this was a child compared to that stern book, a book of days. On the first page, a hand. Inez's mother's. The first line, Inez took her first step on the day the river came late and the bread burned, and I laughed instead of crying because both are how we pay attention. The world tilted. Inez sat on the step because standing had become a thing for other times. She was always writing, she whispered, as if it were illegal to say the obvious now and not notice it then. I thought it was grocery lists. Maria's hand found her nape, the grip mothers use on daughters of any age when grief and pride are too big and need a gentle leash. Grocery lists feed us, she said. So do stories. The canyon darkened calmly. The car clicked as it cooled. Far off, the town made the noise towns make when supper is a negotiation between fatigue and gratitude. The day did not congratulate them. It was too honest for that. It granted them a next hour. That was better. Will he come? Inez asked at last, because peace is sweetest where it has something to be compared against. Yes, Sal said. He doesn't forgive. He reorganizes. Then we'll be ready, Inez said. The words tasted true. Not easy. Not cheap. True. Sal smiled without showing teeth. You're calder enough. They slept in shifts. Nash on the shed floor with his hat over his face, pretending not to be keeping watch. Maria in the car, lamp-hooded, breathing the way people who have spent too long underground have to learn to breathe again on purpose. Inez on the step with the journal under her hand and the ledger within arm's reach as if her pulse lived in both at once. She woke to a sound she learned instantly to hate, a horse's cautious hoof on gravel and a man who would not clear his throat because he did not believe in giving other people the pleasure of preparation. The auditor. Not in the square. Not with his papers. Here, where he believed steel and wood and two women would be easier than law. Sal didn't move. She had been awake since the hoof. He won't shoot, she murmured. He likes to watch people choose not to be brave. Maria slid off the car step like a cat and disappeared around the back where the ditch could turn her into shadow with fingers. The auditor reined in at the mouth of the siding. He did not dismount. Good evening, he said, as if he had brought a pie. It is, Sal agreed, because she had not yet met a sentence she could not make truer by speaking it. He looked at the car without awe. I will have it, he said. You have made interesting noises with it. Noise is fashion. Ownership is law. Ownership is practice, Sal said. Ah, he said, that private little sound. Yes. And you have practiced poorly for a long time. It will take years for you to become good at the kind of cruelty I am. We won't, Inez said, and surprised herself. Not at that. We'll be excellent at another kind. He cocked his head, amused. Which? Patience, she said. And memory. And teaching people not to need you. He smiled as if at a precocious child. A charming ambition. I'll return with a writ in men who like to earn money by declaring that men like me are the source of it. He turned his horse. Sleep while you can. Wait, Inez said. He waited, indulgent. She held up the little journal. Do you want to know how I learned to stand in front of you and not shake? Not particularly, he said, because honesty costs him nothing when it is cruel. I read my mother's handwriting, she said. She didn't write laws. She wrote the day. She wrote what went wrong and who forgave whom and why. She wrote that a loaf burned and she laughed. That's the difference between us. You collect signatures and think they build anything. We collect days. He watched her for a long, quiet moment she had not expected him to allow. He did not like losing. But he liked new variables. Finally he tipped his hat, a tiny movement. Not respect. A footnote. Then you will understand, he said mildly, that tomorrow is a day, too. He rode away. When he was gone, the canyon breathed again. Sal let out a breath she had not let anyone count. Maria reappeared, hands empty, satisfied that empty was correct. Tomorrow, Inez said softly, and felt the word not as threat but as promise and work. There was too much to do and not enough bodies to do it. Perfect. That was how you knew you were working on the right size thing. They put the town to it, binding, copying, reading, learning to argue without paying the price anger exacts when it borrows your mouth. They taught children to trace names with careful fingers while listening to their elders tell the truth at last about who had made sure their water ran and who had lied and who had learned to be useful after learning to be a coward. Hollis fetched. Better than anyone expected. Worse than he would later claim. He brought a list of dummy companies with pretty names, Sunset Holdings, Verde Partners, Orison, and the real names that paid their bills. He brought the schedule for a train car of men who would wear badges on loan. He brought, with shaking fingers he pretended were steady, a letter the auditor had written to a judge in the next county that said essentially, make what I need to happen be true. Doc Maribel drafted a counter letter that said essentially, I dare you to do that in writing, and then I will teach your wife what you think of her life. Alba baked as if sugar could be enlisted as infantry. Nash took the dummy list into the bar and read it like a sermon, and a half-dozen men got very quiet and then interested in being better. Greeley, the boy with the scar, showed up at the shed at dusk and stood for a long time with his hat in his hands before he found words. My mother says I can either shame her or make her tired, he announced solemnly. She asked me to pick tired. Good woman, Sal said. Bring your hands. She put him to work with a file and a railhead and a lecture on the physics of friction that he would turn into a metaphor and pretend he invented when he was 30. Night came with the sound of men who had been paid to come tomorrow practicing being brave in rooms that were not their town. Morning came with the sound of the same men realizing bravery is most efficient when it can be delegated. Noon came with a cloud of dust at the edge of everything that meant the auditor had kept his word about returning promptly with law on a leash. They were ready enough. The deputies, some borrowed, some bought, some middle kinds, rode into a square that had been arranged to look uninteresting. No crowd. No drama. Only women hanging laundry that was too clean to need hanging and men mending tools that had been mended yesterday. Children playing with a ball that was more a meeting than a toy. The auditor dismounted with the ease of a man who thinks gravity works for him. He handed papers to the judge who had decided to be present for his own embarrassment. He said the things men like him say when they have not yet learned that the floor has been moved. Inez stood with Maria beside the well, hands empty of books and full of nothing in particular. She watched the moment when a town that had lost its fear did the most dangerous thing it can do, played normal until it was time to be loud. Where's the car? The auditor asked, and Hollis, to his lasting minor credit, did not say. The men who had been willing to be redeemed yesterday leaned against door jambs in ways that were not slouching and were not servile. They had licenses to decide what they were next. They used them. Seize the property, the auditor said, and the deputies moved, finally grateful to be given something to do that would not require too much self-reconsideration. They moved in the wrong direction. Because in the night, Sal and Nash and Greeley and 6 others had taken the chain that had pretended to stop a car and taught the car to stop a street. It lay now across the mouth of the square, not like a gate but like a line in a book. The deputies, who had been prepared to arrest the machine, found a sentence instead. "What is this?" the judge squawked, which is the sound certain kinds of education always make when they meet reality. "Punctuation," Doc Maribel said sweetly. "It tells you where to pause and think." The auditor did not miss the meaning. He looked past the chain, past the people, at Inez. "You are making this tedious," he observed. "Good," she said. "Tedium is how you starve the part of yourself that prefers drama to decency." He almost laughed. He didn't, because the day had a way of using even small joy against him. "Bring me the ledger," he said finally, tired of the performance, and Inez did the bravest thing she had done yet. She said, "No," and did not explain. The explanations had been said yesterday. The work would be done tomorrow. Today, they enforced a pause. He could have taken it by force. He had men with guns and a judge who liked the smell of his own writ. He didn't. Not because he was kind. Because he was counting. Because the square had enough eyes to become a kind of court he couldn't cheat. He took a small breath you would have mistaken for contemplation if you hadn't learned him already. "Very well," he said at last. "We will be civilized." He tucked his papers away, which was a performance he was very good at. "We will see one another in rooms with chairs that make the poor uncomfortable. Bring cushions," Doc Maribel advised pleasantly. "Those rooms will be ours by then." He left. Not forever. Not with shame. With a plan that would take him months to believe was not working anymore. He rode toward the courthouse with men who had not decided what kind of fathers they would be yet. Hollis lingered, 2 steps behind Inez like a dog who had convinced himself he could be both stray and useful. "Fetch," she reminded him. He grinned faintly and went. Afternoon widened into that gentle hour where the world decides not to hold you responsible for the next thing yet. People did what people do, washed floors, mended fences, told jokes too rough for children and laughed until children learned them anyway. Sal came up from the siding with Garnet at her hip and a satisfaction in her stride that made men who liked to be unhappy reconsider their hobbies. "What now?" Maria asked, not because she didn't know, but because she liked the sound of Inez's answers. "Now we build rooms with windows," Inez said. The line came from her mother, written years ago and kept warm on the page. "We leave the doors open. We write names on the walls until the walls get shy and learn to be honest." She looked at the car where it rested like a breath held and released. "We keep the floor true." As if answering, a small sound drifted from the canyon, a clink, a click, the car's private liturgy. It was not a warning. It was a reminder. Evening came, the square filled. Doc Maribel took the stump of a crate and made it a table and then a pulpit and then not a pulpit because she did not like the distance the word implies. Inez read again, shorter, with more names answered by more voices. The children learned to repeat. Grilly stood near the front, hands in his pockets like a man practicing not being foolish. Hollis lurked at the edge of propriety with papers that would later send interesting letters to auditors who believed in envelopes. When the first star climbed, Inez closed the journal that had become her mother in a new way and said the thing that had been waiting at the back of her tongue all day, the sentence the car had been rolling toward since someone filed its first rivet. "Tomorrow," she said, not loud, just enough to be a promise, "we start teaching anyone who wants it how to read the kind of books they keep you from and how to write the kind of names they are afraid of." People didn't cheer. They breathed, and in the breathing agreed. Later, when the square was down to faces you know by the way they stand in moonlight, Sal sat with Inez on the wagon tongue and chewed what was left of supper. Garnet dozed standing up like a good soldier. Maria slept with her hand on the ledger as if daring anyone to try and move it while her body argued. Nash snored like a moral. "You did it," Sal said. "We started," Inez said. For the first time since the flood she let her head drop onto someone's shoulder and discovered the world did not fall off its axis when she chose rest. "Same thing," Sal said. She tipped her head against Inez's. "Tomorrow he comes with paper again. The day after that with men. The day after that, with a different paper. We will get tired." We will not be finished. That's how you know it's worth it. I'm not afraid, Inez said, surprised to hear it and not surprised at all. I know, Sal said. That's why I'm allowed to be. They sat until the night came all the way in and made itself comfortable. The car, their odd church, their safe dangerous room, chuffed once as wood cooled and gave back heat to air. The canyon roofed the stars. The desert watched like an old aunt who has seen most things and is pleased when someone invents a new dignity. Inez thought, because there was a little room at last to think, of her mother's handwriting, of Sal's hands on gears, of Maria's voice in the square, of Doc Maribel's laughter turning into orders, of Nash's patience, of Greeley's chin, of Hollis's fetch, of Garnett's hocks. Of Alba's cookies and the chain singing a wrong song and then the right one. Of the auditor's eyes not blinking and then blinking. Of how flood had become a beginning instead of a ruin. Tomorrow would be work. Tomorrow would be the trial of every small thing. Tomorrow would be the moment when men who had lost power realized power had been returning itself to its owners all day while they read their own names on the wrong page. She smiled, a tiredness like mercy in her bones, and pressed her palm against the car's side, against one rivet that had not been a rivet for 3 women's lifetimes and would be a button for the lifetime of everyone Inez would teach. Home, she said. The car did not answer. It didn't have to. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.